No prisoner speaks after lights out. Every woman inside Barrack 14 knew the rule. They knew it the same way they knew the sound of boots on frozen gravel or the way hunger sat like a stone beneath the ribs. February 1945. Western Germany. Snow drifted against the outer fences of Camp Eisenfeld while floodlights painted long white bars across the yard. The wind moved through the watchtowers with a low, hollow whistle that never seemed to stop. At 2:13 in the morning, Corporal James Whitmore stood beneath Tower 3 with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had already gone cold. 8 months guarding prisoners had reduced most nights to routine. Count the shadows. Check the locks. Keep walking. The war had exhausted everyone equally. The guards looked tired. The prisoners looked tired. Even the dogs slept through most patrols now. James pulled his coat tighter against the cold and glanced toward the women's barracks. Frost coated the windows in pale layers, turning the building into a block of dull white beneath the yellow lamps. Somewhere far beyond the fences, artillery rolled like distant thunder. Fainter tonight. Further away. The war was moving east. A train whistle echoed across the frozen countryside. Then silence again. James checked his wristwatch. 2:13 a.m. Another 4 hours until sunrise. Another 4 hours of snow and breathing steam into the dark. He turned toward the gate when he heard it. Please. The voice was barely louder than the wind. Soft. Female. Careful. James stopped immediately. Every prisoner in the camp knew the consequences of speaking to guards after curfew. Extra labor duty if they were lucky. Isolation if they were not. Slowly, he turned toward the fence line beside Barrack 14. A woman stood near the wire, half hidden beneath the shadow of the floodlight pole. Thin gray coat. Wool scarf. Blonde hair tucked beneath a prisoner cap dusted with snow. Emma Keller. James recognized her instantly. Most guards did. She was the quiet one. The woman who translated for older prisoners during inspections. The one who gave away half her bread to sick women when rations arrived short. She never complained. Never begged. Never caused problems. James had watched her once during a snowstorm hand her blanket to another prisoner whose hands would not stop shaking. She moved through camp like someone trying to remain human in a place designed to wear humanity down slowly. And now she was standing at the fence after curfew, breaking rules for the first time. James stepped closer, boots crunching softly against frozen mud. You're not supposed to be here, he said quietly. Emma looked over her shoulder toward the dark barracks behind her. Her face was pale beneath the floodlight, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked colder than the air itself, but she still stood straight. That was what James noticed first. Even now, even terrified, her shoulders remained square. Please, she whispered again, and this time her voice trembled slightly. Not from fear, from urgency. James waited for her to ask for food, or blankets, or medicine for herself. That was usually how these moments went. But Emma shook her head once and said, almost too softly to hear, there is an older woman inside. Fever. She cannot breathe well anymore. Snow drifted between them in slow white streaks. Somewhere above, the tower light rotated across the yard. Emma swallowed hard before continuing. If I wait until morning, I think she dies before sunrise. James stared at her for several long seconds while the wind pressed against the fences and rattled the loose wire ties overhead. Then something inside him shifted quietly, almost invisibly, like ice beginning to crack beneath thawing water. James glanced once toward the nearest watchtower. The rotating light swept slowly across the far side of the compound, leaving the women's barracks in temporary shadow every 7 seconds. He knew the pattern because he had walked this route hundreds of times. 7 seconds dark. 7 seconds exposed. Procedure became instinct after enough nights. Emma waited silently beside the fence, her breath visible in short white clouds. She did not move closer, did not try to persuade him further. That unsettled James more than pleading would have. Most desperate people talk too much. She only stood there with snow gathering on her coat. Collar, trusting him to decide whether another human being mattered or not. Somewhere inside Barrack 14, a woman coughed hard enough to echo through the wooden walls. The sound ended in a weak wheeze. Emma lowered her eyes briefly. She has been sick for 3 days, she said quietly. The fever became worse tonight. James tightened his grip on the cold coffee cup. Regulations existed for reasons. Prisoners stayed in barracks after curfew. Guards did not open compounds alone. Medical requests waited until morning unless approved by an officer. Everything in military life depended on rules because rules kept chaos from spreading. But the war had stretched those rules thinner every month. Supplies ran short now. Doctors were exhausted. Officers stopped caring about problems they could not see directly in front of them. And somewhere between all of it, people simply learned to endure suffering quietly. James looked again toward the tower light. 7 seconds dark. 7 seconds exposed. Then he set the untouched coffee down beside the fence post. "Wait here," he said. Emma blinked once, surprised by the answer itself. James walked quickly toward the side gate built into the inner fence line. The metal latch groaned softly beneath his gloves as he unlocked it. He paused only once. If another guard reported this, he would spend the next month cleaning latrines at minimum. Worse if the captain decided he had compromised camp security. Behind him, the wind pushed loose snow across the yard in silver ribbons. "Show me," he said. Emma did not move at first. She looked at the open gate the way someone might stare at a church door during a storm, uncertain whether to believe sanctuary was real. Then she stepped carefully through the opening. For a second, neither of them spoke. James noticed how thin she truly was beneath the oversized gray coat. Not fragile exactly, just worn down slowly by months of shortages and cold weather. The same thing was happening across Europe now. Whole populations surviving one careful day at a time. Emma led him across the narrow yard beside the barracks. Snow crunched beneath their boots. No one else stirred. Most prisoners slept lightly. But exhaustion eventually overcame fear. Inside the wooden building, the air smelled faintly of damp wool, coal smoke, and sickness. Rows of narrow bunks stretched through the dim room beneath a single hanging bulb. Several women looked up immediately as the guard entered. Fear flashed across their faces first, then confusion. Emma moved quickly toward the back corner where an older prisoner lay beneath 2 army blankets. The woman could not have weighed more than 90 pounds. Gray hair clung damply to her forehead. Her breathing came shallow and uneven. James crouched beside the bunk while Emma knelt opposite him. "Her name is Marta Vogel," Emma whispered. "Schoolteacher from Cologne." Marta opened her eyes weakly at the sound of voices. She looked terrified when she saw the American uniform beside her bed. James removed one glove and touched the woman's forehead carefully. The heat startled him immediately. Fever. Real fever. Not exaggeration. Emma reached for a small metal cup beside the bed. "Empty. She needs water first," she said softly. "Then aspirin if possible." James nodded once and stood. Several prisoners continued staring at him from their bunks in absolute silence. One younger woman crossed herself quietly beneath her blanket, as if afraid the moment might disappear if anyone spoke too loudly. James suddenly understood what they were seeing. Not a guard breaking rules. Something rarer. Proof that kindness had not completely vanished from the world outside these fences. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I will be back," he said. And for the first time since arriving at Camp Eisenfeld, every woman in Barrack 14 believed an American soldier meant exactly what he said. The camp kitchen sat behind the main administration building, its windows glowing pale yellow against the snow-covered yard. James walked fast, but not fast enough to attract attention. The cold bit through his coat collar, while frost cracked softly beneath his boots. Above him, the floodlights continued their slow mechanical sweep across Camp Eisenfeld, turning fences silver one moment and black the next. Inside the kitchen, the night cook barely looked up from his newspaper. Corporal Eddie Nolan had worked camp duty long enough to stop asking questions after midnight. A cigarette rested between 2 fingers while jazz music hummed quietly from a tabletop radio near the coffee urns. "You are late for your refill," Nolan muttered without interest. James grabbed a metal kettle from the stove and checked the shelves behind the counter. "Need aspirin," he said. Nolan frowned immediately. "At this hour?" James opened a drawer until he found a small brown bottle with a white medical label. Army issue. Nearly empty. Supplies had been running low for weeks now. "Who is sick?" Nolan asked. James hesitated only briefly. "Prisoner." The word hung in the warm kitchen air for a moment. Nolan lowered the newspaper slowly. "Whitmore," he said carefully. "You planning to get yourself court-martialed over there?" James unscrewed the aspirin bottle and counted 4 tablets into his palm. "She is old," he replied. "Probably pneumonia." Nolan leaned back in his chair, studying him quietly. Outside, Wind rattled the kitchen windows hard enough to make the glass tremble. Finally, Nolan sighed and reached beneath the counter for a cloth-wrapped loaf of leftover bread. "Take this too," he muttered. "If anyone asks, I never saw you." James accepted the bread without speaking. Men stopped thanking each other openly during wartime. Gratitude became something quieter, a shared understanding instead. 10 minutes later, he stepped back into the frozen yard carrying the kettle beneath one arm, while steam escaped around the lid in white ribbons. Snowflakes drifted through the floodlights like ash. Barack 14 remained dark except for the faint bulb hanging near the entrance. Emma waited just inside the doorway exactly where he had left her. She looked startled when she saw everything in his hands. "You came back," she whispered. James handed her the kettle first. "Careful. It is hot." Emma wrapped both hands around the metal instantly, as if absorbing warmth directly into her bones. For the first time, James noticed how red her knuckles had become from winter exposure. The skin looked cracked near the fingertips. Nurse hands, worn down by cold water and rough work. She stared briefly at the loaf of bread tucked beneath his arm. Not greedy, not desperate, just surprised. That expression bothered James more than hunger ever could. No one should look shocked by kindness. Inside the barracks, several women sat upright now, watching silently from their bunks as Emma crossed the room beside him. The atmosphere had changed entirely. Fear still existed, but something else moved quietly underneath it now. Curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. Emma knelt beside Marta Vogel again and carefully lifted the older woman's shoulders while James poured warm water into the empty cup. Marta's trembling hands could barely hold it steady. Emma supported the cup gently while speaking to her in low German whispers. Her voice changed when she spoke to the sick woman. Softer, calmer, like someone rebuilding order inside chaos, one careful word at a time. James stood nearby holding the aspirin bottle while several prisoners watched him as though trying to understand what kind of soldier carried medicine into a prison barracks after curfew. One younger woman, near the back, wiped tears quickly before turning toward the wall. Emma looked up. 2 tablets only, she said quietly. Her heart is weak. James nodded and handed them over without question. That surprised Emma almost as much as the medicine itself. Most guards assumed prisoners exaggerated illnesses. Most guards stopped listening halfway through explanations. But James listened carefully. Like her words mattered. Marta swallowed the pills slowly before sinking back against the pillow. Her breathing still sounded strained, but less panicked now. Emma adjusted the blankets around her shoulders with practiced movements. Then she looked toward James again. "Thank you," she said softly. He shrugged awkwardly and removed his gloves near the stove barrel beside the wall, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. "My mother was a nurse," he said after a moment. "Des Moines General Hospital." Emma blinked once. The details seemed strangely personal inside a prison camp at 2:30 in the morning. James stared down at the kettle steam curling toward the ceiling. "She used to say fever scares people more than pain," he added quietly, "because pain feels human. Fever feels like disappearing." The barracks became completely still after that. Even the wind outside seemed farther away for a moment. Emma studied him differently now. Not as a guard. Not entirely as an enemy either. Just a tired man standing beside a coal stove in the middle of winter, trying to remember what decency looked like before the war taught everyone to expect less from each other. By morning the storm had passed, leaving Camp Eisenfeld buried beneath 6 inches of fresh snow that reflected the pale gray sky like frozen ash. Smoke drifted from the kitchen chimneys in thin, crooked lines while guards changed shifts beneath the towers with collars pulled high against the cold. The camp woke slowly. Metal gates creaked open. Boots crossed icy gravel. Somewhere near the motor pool, an engine struggled to start before finally catching with a low cough of smoke. James Whitmore stood outside the administration office sipping burnt coffee from a dented tin mug while reading the morning assignment board. Prisoner labor details had been reduced again because of weather. Rail repairs postponed. Supply trucks delayed. Everything in Germany moved slower now. Winter and war together had exhausted the country down to its bones. "You look terrible," Sergeant Miller muttered beside him while buttoning his coat. James glanced over. "Thank you." Miller snorted quietly. "You were up half the night?" James shrugged once and folded the assignment paper beneath his arm. "Could not sleep." It was not entirely a lie. He had slept less than 2 hours after leaving Barack 14. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the look on Emma Keller's face when he opened the gate. Not fear. Not relief exactly. Something more dangerous. Surprise. As if kindness itself had become unfamiliar. That thought stayed with him longer than he wanted. Near noon, snow began falling again in thin drifting flakes. James crossed the yard toward the women's compound carrying a clipboard and inspection forms he barely intended to use. Officially, he was checking furnace conditions after the storm. Unofficially, he wanted to know whether Marta Vogel had survived the night. Barack 14 smelled warmer now when he stepped inside. Damp wool dried near the stove barrel, while low conversation moved softly through the room. Several women looked up immediately at his entrance, but the fear from last night had shifted into cautious uncertainty. One prisoner near the front nodded politely before returning to sewing a torn sleeve beside the stove. Human routines had returned. Quietly, Emma stood near the back window wringing water from washed cloth strips into a metal basin. Weak winter light touched the side of her face while snow drifted beyond the frosted glass behind her. She looked exhausted, but steadier somehow, more grounded. Marta's fever broke this morning, she said before James could ask. Her English remained careful and precise, each word chosen slowly. James felt tension leave his shoulders without realizing it had settled there. That is good. Emma nodded once. She slept almost 4 hours. For hours. In wartime, for uninterrupted hours could feel like a miracle. James moved toward Marta's bunk where the older woman now sat upright beneath folded blankets drinking weak tea from a chipped enamel cup. Her face still looked pale, but her breathing sounded easier. When she noticed James approaching, her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "This is the guard?" she asked softly in German. Emma translated quietly beside him. James shook his head once. "Just James." Emma hesitated before repeating the words in German. Something changed in the older woman's expression after hearing them. Not trust exactly, but recognition perhaps. Recognition that the uniform standing in front of her belonged to a person before it belonged to a country. Marta lowered the cup carefully. "Tell him thank you," she whispered. Emma translated. James rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly beneath his gloves. "Tell her my mother would have yelled at me if I ignored a sick woman." Emma actually smiled then. Small, brief, gone almost immediately, but real. The expression transformed her face so completely that James nearly forgot where he was standing. Not beautiful in the polished magazine sense. Just alive. Human. Warm in a place that had become emotionally frozen months ago. Across the room, several prisoners noticed the smile too. One older woman quietly returned to knitting after watching the exchange with unreadable eyes. Emma adjusted Marta's blankets again before speaking softly. "Most guards do not come back after making promises." James looked toward the frosted window where snow continued falling over fences and watchtowers outside. "Most people are tired," he said. "Sometimes tired people stop noticing what matters." Emma studied him carefully for several seconds. The room around them remained quiet except for the crackle of coal inside the stove barrel and the faint tapping of sleet against glass. Finally, she asked, "And you still notice?" James thought about the train stations in France filled with exhausted civilians. About boys barely old enough to shave marching east with hollow faces. About his mother writing letters from Iowa describing church bake sales while Europe collapsed one frozen mile at a time. Then he looked back at Emma Keller standing beside the basin with red cracked hands and tired eyes that still carried dignity no prison had managed to remove. "I am trying to," he said quietly. And for reasons neither of them fully understood yet, the answer settled into the silence between them like something worth remembering. 3 days later, the temperature dropped below 10 degrees, and the pipes beneath the eastern barracks froze solid before sunrise. Guards spent the morning hauling buckets of water through knee-deep snow while prisoners wrapped blankets around cracked windows to keep the wind outside. Camp Eisenfeld had stopped pretending to function normally weeks ago. Supplies arrived late. Coal ran low. Men walked slower now. Even the officers looked worn down by winter. James Whitmore stood outside the infirmary loading firewood beside Sergeant Miller when a military truck rolled through the front gate carrying new prisoners from the Western rail lines. The truck moved slowly across the frozen yard beneath layers of dirty snow. No one inside spoke while guards opened the rear gate. James watched exhausted figures climb down one by one, wearing mismatched coats and thin scarves against the cold. Civilians mostly. Some elderly. A few former military clerks. One woman could barely stand without support. Another transfer from Cologne, Miller muttered. Whole country is falling apart. James nodded, but said nothing. He noticed something else instead. Emma Keller stood near the women's compound fence, helping organize blankets for the incoming prisoners before anyone asked her to. She moved carefully through the snow, carrying folded wool against her chest, while speaking softly to frightened women in German. No panic. No drama. Just calm efficiency. James had begun noticing that about her. Wherever fear spread, Emma seemed to lower the temperature of the room simply by remaining steady herself. An hour later, he found her inside the laundry building, sorting through donated clothing beside two older prisoners. Steam drifted through the room from large boiling vats, while wet fabric hung from overhead lines like pale flags. The air smelled of soap and damp wool. Emma glanced up briefly when he entered carrying a crate of medical supplies. "Marta is walking again," she said quietly, as if continuing a conversation from days earlier. James set the crate down near the wall. "That fast?" Emma nodded once. "She asked for real coffee this morning. That usually means people plan on surviving." The faint humor in her voice caught him off guard. James smiled before he could stop himself. One of the older women nearby noticed immediately and exchanged a subtle look with the other prisoner before returning to folding blankets. News traveled quietly inside camps. Emma handed a wool scarf to a shivering new arrival seated near the stove. The young woman accepted it with trembling hands and immediately began crying from exhaustion alone. Emma rested a hand gently against her shoulder until the tears slowed. No speeches, no dramatic comfort, just presence. James watched silently for several seconds. "You do that naturally," he said finally. Emma looked over. "What? Make people feel less afraid." She lowered her eyes toward the folded blankets in her hands. "Fear spreads quickly in places like this," she replied softly. "If someone stays calm, sometimes others remember how." Outside, wind pushed snow hard against the laundry windows while pipes groaned somewhere deep inside the building walls. James removed his gloves beside the stove and warmed stiff fingers near the heat. "My younger sister used to do that back home," he said after a moment. "During storms." Emma listened quietly while continuing her work. "Iowa storms?" she asked. James looked surprised. "You know Iowa?" "Only from books," she admitted. "Wide fields. Tornadoes. Corn." James laughed softly under his breath. "That is mostly accurate." Emma glanced toward him again, and for a second the camp around them seemed to disappear beneath something simpler. Two ordinary people discussing weather instead of war. The moment felt strangely fragile. Then the laundry room door swung open hard enough to rattle the hanging pipes overhead. Lieutenant Harris stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat sleeves with visible irritation. Everything about him looked sharp. Sharp jawline, sharp boots, sharp voice. Unlike most soldiers at Eisenfeld, Harris still carried himself like the war had not exhausted him yet. His eyes moved across the room once before stopping on James, standing near the stove. "Whitmore," he said flatly, "you have become popular in this compound lately." The room immediately quieted. Even the women folding laundry slowed their hands. James straightened slightly. "Sir." Harris stepped closer, gaze drifting toward the medical crate beside the wall. "Interesting reports from night patrol," he continued. "Medicine deliveries. Extra blankets. Unscheduled visits." Snow tapped lightly against the windows behind him. Emma lowered her eyes toward the laundry table, but James noticed her shoulders tense almost invisibly. Harris followed his line of sight toward her. "You are not here to make friends with prisoners," the lieutenant said coldly. "You understand that." James held his expression steady. "I understand we are supposed to treat them according to regulations." Harris studied him for a long moment. Then he glanced once more around the room filled with tired women clutching blankets beside steaming wash vats. "Compassion is a luxury. During war, Corporal," he said quietly, "do not confuse kindness with duty." He turned and walked back into the storm without another word. The door slammed shut behind him. For several seconds no one moved at all. Then the pipes hissed overhead again. Water dripped somewhere near the stove. Life resumed carefully. Emma continued folding blankets without looking up, but her voice came softer than before when she finally spoke. People who say kindness is weakness, she murmured, usually forgot what strength actually looks like. James looked at her across the steam-filled laundry room while snow buried the fences outside 1 inch at a time. And for the first time since arriving in Germany, he realized the bravest person in Camp Eisenfeld was not carrying a weapon at all. The rumors started quietly after that. In camps, rumors always moved faster than official orders. By the end of the week, prisoners whispered that the American corporal in the gray wool coat sometimes carried extra coal to Barrack 14 when temperatures dropped at night. Guards whispered that Whitmore spent too much time inside the women's compound asking questions no ordinary sentry bothered asking anymore. No one said anything directly to his face. Not yet. But James could feel the change each time conversations stopped half a second too late when he entered a room. Winter deepened across western Germany. Snow piled against fences higher than the wheels of supply trucks, while the Rhine Valley disappeared beneath endless gray skies. Some mornings the camp loudspeaker froze before roll call, and soldiers had to shout instructions through the compounds with red cracked hands wrapped around steaming coffee cups. The war felt tired now. Not triumphant. Just tired. One evening near dusk, James carried a crate of canned soup toward the infirmary while icy winds swept through the camp hard enough to sting his eyes. Floodlights flickered alive one by one above the fences as darkness settled early across the snow. Near Barrack 14, he noticed movement beside the water pump. Emma Keller stood alone filling 2 metal buckets while sleet tapped softly against the frozen ground around her boots. The pump handle resisted each movement from the cold. She wore no gloves. James set the crate down immediately. "You are going to lose your fingers out here," he said. Emma looked over her shoulder, slightly startled by his sudden appearance. "The line inside was too long," she replied. Her breath drifted white through the freezing air. James walked over and took the pump handle without another word. The metal felt like ice against his palms. Water groaned slowly through the frozen pipes before finally spilling into the buckets below. Emma watched him quietly for a moment beneath the yellow floodlight. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of his coat, while steam escaped faintly from the nearby kitchen chimney. "You should not help this much," she said softly. James kept working the handle. "That sounds familiar." Emma almost smiled. Lieutenant Harris was serious. "Lieutenant Harris thinks compassion is a contagious disease. And you do not." James stopped pumping long enough to glance toward her. The camp behind them hummed with distant evening sounds. Boots crossing gravel. A truck engine idling near the supply depot. Someone laughing faintly from the guard barracks before the sound disappeared into the wind. "No," he said quietly. "I think it is the only thing that keeps places like this from becoming worse." Emma lowered her eyes toward the rising water in the buckets. "In Germany," she said after a long pause, "people stopped being kind gradually. Not all at once. First they became afraid. Then tired. Then careful about who deserved sympathy." The words settled heavily between them. James noticed she was not speaking only about war anymore. She was speaking about entire societies. About what happened when ordinary people slowly stopped seeing each other clearly. He finished filling the second bucket and straightened slowly, flexing numb fingers against the cold. Emma reached for the handles, but James stopped her. "I will carry them. You already carried enough." "Emma." She looked up at the sound of her name spoken softly. Neither of them moved for a second. Snow drifted sideways through the floodlight around them, while the camp fences cast long dark shadows across the ground. Then Emma released the bucket handles without argument. They walked toward Barrack 14 together in silence. The water sloshed gently with each step. Near the entrance, a younger prisoner opened the door and immediately froze when she saw the American corporal carrying buckets beside Emma, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Her eyes widened slightly before she stepped aside without speaking. Inside, warmth from the coal stove fogged the windows. Several women looked up from mending clothes and peeling potatoes near the back tables. The room became still again in that strange way it always did whenever James entered now. Not fearful silence. Observant silence. He set the buckets beside the stove while Emma thanked him quietly. Marta Vogel sat wrapped in blankets near the far wall, knitting something uneven from gray yarn salvaged out of old sweaters. Her color had returned almost completely. "Corporal Whitmore," she called softly in accented English. James turned. Marta held up the knitting needles with a faint smile. "For your hands," she said. James stared for a second before realizing she was making gloves. Crude gloves. Uneven gloves. But gloves nonetheless. You do not have to do that, he said. Marta shrugged gently. Teachers become stubborn, old women eventually. A few prisoners laughed softly under their breath. The sound surprised everyone in the room, including themselves. James felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest hearing laughter inside a prison camp during winter. Emma watched him from beside the stove, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Then the outer barracks door suddenly opened again, letting cold air rush violently through the room. Lieutenant Harris stepped inside with snow on his boots and 2 military policemen behind him. The warmth vanished instantly. Harris scanned the room once before his eyes landed on James, standing beside the water buckets. "Corporal Whitmore," he said calmly. "My office." Now. No one moved. The only sound came from the stove crackling softly beside Emma, while snow hissed against the frozen windows outside. James looked once toward her before turning back toward Harris. Emma did not speak, but her hands tightened quietly around the edge of the stove until her knuckles turned white. Lieutenant Harris did not speak during the walk across camp. Snow fell steadily beneath the floodlights while the 3 men crossed the frozen yard in silence, boots grinding against ice with slow, deliberate rhythm. James kept his eyes forward. Around them, Camp Eisenfeld settled into another bitter winter night. Smoke drifted from chimney stacks. Guards rotated shifts along the towers. Somewhere beyond the eastern fence, a church bell rang faintly through the snow-covered darkness. The war outside continued moving toward its end, but inside the camp everything still felt suspended between exhaustion and routine. Harris opened the administration building door without looking back. Warm air carrying the smell of coffee and paper rushed outward into the cold. James stepped inside. The office lights seemed painfully bright after the dim yellow glow of the barracks. Maps covered the walls beside supply charts and prisoner transfer lists marked with black ink. A coal stove clicked softly near the filing cabinets while snow melted from Harris's boots onto the wooden floorboards. "Sit down," Harris said flatly. James remained standing for a moment before finally lowering himself into the chair opposite the desk. One military policeman closed the office door behind him with a quiet click that suddenly made the room feel much smaller. Harris removed his gloves carefully, placing them beside a stack of reports. "Do you know why you are here?" James looked toward the frosted office window where snow swirled beneath the floodlights outside. "Because I carried water buckets?" Harris's expression did not change. "Because you have forgotten where your responsibilities end." He opened a folder slowly. Inside were handwritten reports, shift logs, supply inventory sheets, extra medical access, unauthorized movement between compounds, additional food distributions. Harris tapped the papers lightly with one finger. "You have become unusually involved with the prisoners under your supervision." James stayed quiet. Harris leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what happens when guards become emotionally attached to prisoners?" "I am not attached to anyone, sir." Harris gave a faint, humorless smile. That answer arrived too quickly. The stove cracked softly in the corner. Outside, a truck engine groaned somewhere beyond the motor pool before fading again into the storm. Harris studied James for several long seconds before speaking again. "I have served in this war since North Africa," he said quietly. "I have watched good soldiers lose perspective because they confused sympathy with morality. You start bending one rule for the right reason, then another. Eventually, discipline disappears." James finally looked directly at him. "And if discipline costs people their humanity?" The room became completely still. One of the military policemen shifted uncomfortably near the wall. Harris folded his hands together slowly. "Humanity does not win wars, Corporal." "No," James answered quietly. "But maybe it decides what kind of people are left afterward." Harris stared at him in silence. The words hung heavily between them while snow scratched softly against the office windows. Finally, the lieutenant stood and walked toward the coffee pot near the stove. He poured himself half a cup without offering any to James. "You think I do not understand suffering?" he asked without turning around. "Every train arriving here carries starving civilians, sick prisoners, children separated from families. The entire continent is drowning in grief." Steam curled upward from the coffee cup in his hands. "If I let every soldier follow feelings instead of regulations, this place collapses in 2 days." James looked down briefly at his gloves resting on his knees. Worn leather, cracked near the fingertips from winter patrols. He remembered Emma's hands gripping the edge of the stove when Harris entered the barracks. He remembered the disbelief in Marta Vogel's eyes when an American soldier returned with medicine instead of punishment. Small moments. But somehow those moments felt more important lately than the paperwork stacked around this office. The prisoners in Barrack 14 are not dangerous, James said carefully. Most are teachers, nurses, clerks. They are cold and exhausted. Harris turned back slowly. And they are still enemy prisoners. Some of them stopped being enemies long before they arrived here. Harris walked back toward the desk and lowered himself into his chair again. For the first time all evening, he looked older than his rank. More tired. You know what your problem is, Whitmore? James said nothing. Harris stared down at the reports spread across the desk. You still believe people remain good if given the chance. He shook his head faintly. War cures most men of that illusion. James glanced once toward the storm outside. Maybe war only proves how necessary it is. Silence followed again, long enough for the stove to settle with a low metallic pop beside the wall. Then unexpectedly, Harris closed the folder. No formal discipline, he said at last. James looked up. Harris removed his glasses and rubbed tired eyes with one hand. Officially, I am warning you to maintain professional boundaries moving forward. He paused briefly. Unofficially, snow drifted sideways outside beneath the floodlights. Do not make me regret overlooking this. James rose slowly from the chair. Understood, sir. Harris nodded once, but did not look at him again. As James reached the office door, the lieutenant spoke one final time without lifting his eyes from the paperwork. The nurse, he said quietly. Emma Keller. James stopped. Yes, sir. Harris stared silently at the reports for another moment before speaking. People survive places like this because someone reminds them they are still human. His voice sounded strangely distant now, almost reflective. Just be careful you do not lose yourself trying to save everyone else. James stepped back out into the frozen night, carrying those words with him, while snow continued falling softly over Camp Eisenfeld, covering fences, watchtowers, and footprints alike until the entire camp looked almost peaceful from a distance. March arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, and with it came the first signs that winter was finally loosening its grip on Western Germany. Snow along the fence lines began collapsing into gray slush during the afternoons. Water dripped steadily from barrack roofs. The air still carried cold through the mornings, but now there were moments when sunlight touched the camp long enough for people to stop and notice it. At Camp Eisenfeld, small changes felt enormous. One afternoon, a prisoner working near the kitchen heard birds for the first time in months and stood completely still, just listening until a guard told him to keep moving. Even the guard seemed less sharp around the edges lately. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it approaching, though nobody knew exactly what the ending would look like. James Whitmore noticed another change too. The prisoners in Barrack 14 had started smiling again. Not constantly, not openly, but quietly. A woman humming while folding laundry. Marta Vogel complaining about weak coffee with enough energy to sound irritated instead of exhausted. Someone pinning a tiny paper flower near the stove made from old newspaper scraps and faded thread. Tiny acts. Tiny rebellions against despair. James stood outside the women's compound one late afternoon while pale sunlight reflected off melting ice across the yard. He carried a clipboard under one arm, though he had forgotten entirely why he brought it. Through the barrack window, he could see Emma Keller seated beside Marta, helping repair torn coats with a needle and dark thread. Her head bent slightly toward the work. Calm. Focused. The same way she had looked caring for sick prisoners during the storm weeks earlier. James realized he had begun measuring his days by whether he saw that expression or not. The thought unsettled him enough that he almost walked away before she noticed him through the glass and rose from the table. A minute later, she stepped outside carrying 2 tin cups steaming faintly in the cold air. Coffee, she said, or something pretending to be coffee. James accepted the cup carefully. That still counts. They stood beside the fence in comfortable silence while afternoon wind moved gently through the camp. Somewhere near the garages, soldiers shouted over the sound of an engine repair. Farther away came the metallic clang of kitchen trays being stacked for supper. Ordinary sounds. Human sounds. Emma rapped, both hands around her cup for warmth. Marta says spring always smells different after hard winters, she said quietly. James glanced toward the muddy snowbanks beginning to melt beside the fence posts. In Iowa, spring mostly smells like wet dirt and tractors. Emma laughed softly under her breath. The sound lingered between them longer than expected. Then her expression faded slightly. I do not know what happens after this, she admitted. After the war. James looked at her carefully. None of us do. Emma stared out beyond the fences where fading sunlight turned the remaining snow pale gold. Sometimes I try to remember my apartment in Munich exactly as it was before everything changed, she said. The curtains, the piano downstairs, the bakery across the street. Her voice remained calm, but James heard something underneath it now. Grief perhaps, or fear of returning to a world that no longer existed. And sometimes, she continued softly, I cannot remember clearly anymore. James leaned against the wooden fence post beside her. My father writes me letters every month, he said. Mostly about weather, corn prices, church suppers. Emma looked over with faint curiosity. Why weather? Because it is normal. James stared into the steam rising from his cup. People hold on to ordinary things during war. It reminds them life still exists somewhere outside all this. Emma nodded slowly. I used to play piano for children at the hospital before the war, she said after a long pause. Nothing impressive. Just simple songs while they waited. The image settled into James's mind immediately. Emma seated beside a piano in sunlight instead of prison fences. Children listening quietly while music drifted through hallways untouched by war. The thought hurt in a strange way because it felt so distant from the camp around them. You should do that again someday, he said. Emma lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup in her hands. You speak like there will be a someday. James answered without hesitation. There has to be. Silence followed gently after that. Not empty silence. Resting silence. The kind shared by people no longer trying to protect themselves from every conversation. Then Emma reached into her coat pocket and carefully pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Gray wool gloves. Uneven stitching. Slightly crooked fingers. Marta's knitting. She finished them this morning, Emma said quietly. James stared at the gloves for several seconds before taking them carefully into his hands. The wool felt rough, but warm. Handmade warmth in the middle of a prison camp. Tell Marta thank you. Emma smiled faintly. You can tell her yourself. James looked up, confused. Emma nodded toward the Baroque window behind them. Marta sat inside near the stove pretending very badly not to watch the conversation through the glass. James laughed softly under his breath while slipping one glove on experimentally. The fingers were uneven lengths. Slightly too large. Perfect anyway. Emma watched him for a moment before speaking again, more quietly this time. You know, she said, before I came here, I thought kindness from an enemy meant weakness. That is what we were taught. James looked toward her. Emma's eyes held steady against his. Now I think it may be the bravest thing a person can do. Neither of them spoke after that. The sun continued lowering slowly beyond the fences while snow melt dripped steadily from the Baroque roofs, sounding almost like rain. The announcement came on a rainy morning in April, not through speeches or celebration. Just a typed notice pinned outside the administration building while cold spring rain tapped against the wooden walls of Camp Eisenfeld. Prisoner transfers would begin within the week. Several compounds would be closed. Civilian detainees and non-combat prisoners would be processed for relocation as Allied control expanded deeper into Germany. The war had not fully ended yet, but everyone inside the camp understood what the paper truly meant. The waiting was almost over. By afternoon, the entire camp moved differently. Guards spoke quieter. Prisoners folded belongings with careful hands. Some people smiled. Others looked frightened by freedom itself after surviving so long inside fences and routines. James Whitmore stood beneath the overhang outside the supply building watching rainwater run through muddy tire tracks across the yard. The snow was finally gone now. In its place came gray skies and wet earth, and the smell of thawed ground rising beneath the camp. Spring. Real spring. He should have felt relieved. Instead, something heavy settled quietly inside his chest all morning. Across the yard, Baroque 14 remained lit despite the gloomy weather. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see movement inside as prisoners packed blankets and sorted the few possessions they still owned. A scarf. A photograph. Letters folded thin from rereading. lives reduced to objects small enough to carry away by hand. James found Emma near the laundry building later that evening. Rain drummed softly against the roof while damp air carried the smell of soap and wet wood through the open doorway. She stood beside one of the long tables folding donated coats into careful stacks for departing prisoners. The room felt strangely empty already. "You heard?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded without looking up. "Munich transport. 3 days." Her voice stayed calm, but James noticed the way her fingers paused briefly against the fabric before continuing. "Marta is terrified of trains now," she added softly. "I think half of Europe is." James leaned against the doorway while rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of his cap onto the floorboards. "Do you have family left there?" Emma folded another coat carefully before answering. "A cousin, perhaps. Maybe neighbors." She gave a faint, tired smile. "War teaches people not to make promises about tomorrow." Silence settled between them while rain beat softly overhead. Somewhere outside, a truck engine rumbled through the mud near the outer gates. James looked around the nearly empty laundry room, remembering the first time he entered during the storm weeks earlier. Steam. Wet blankets. Emma standing beside frightened prisoners, trying to hold everyone together through nothing except calmness and patience. It already felt distant somehow. "You help people survive here," he said finally. Emma looked over at him then, genuinely surprised. "So did you?" James shook his head once. "No. I followed you." The words escaped before he could reconsider them. Emma stared at him quietly while rain blurred the camp lights outside the windows behind them. "Why?" she asked after a long pause. James thought about that carefully. About the freezing night beside the fence. About Marta's fever. About Harris asking whether kindness still mattered during war. Then he looked directly at Emma Keller standing beneath the dim laundry room lights with tired eyes and steady hands that never stopped helping others even after losing nearly everything herself. "Because you reminded me what decent people look like," he answered softly. Emma lowered her gaze immediately after hearing that. For the first time since he met her, she seemed unable to find words quickly. Rain continued falling steadily outside while the room filled with the quiet sound of fabric folding beneath her hands. Finally, she spoke so softly he almost missed it. "Back in Munich, before the war, I used to believe strength meant never needing anyone." She looked up slowly. Then everything collapsed. James said nothing. Emma's eyes held his now with complete honesty. "The night Marta became sick," she continued quietly, "I was certain no one would help us. I only asked because I could not watch another person die alone." Her voice trembled slightly for the first time. "And then you opened the gate." Neither of them moved. The rain outside softened into a gentle, steady rhythm against the roof while evening darkness settled over Camp Eisenfeld. Emma reached into her coat pocket after a moment and removed a folded piece of paper. "For later," she said. James accepted it carefully but did not open it yet. Her handwriting showed faintly through the damp paper edges. "What is it?" he asked. Emma smiled sadly. "Something I wanted to say before leaving." 2 days later, the transport trucks arrived just after dawn beneath pale gray skies. Prisoners lined up quietly in the muddy yard carrying bags and blankets while guards checked names against transfer lists. Marta Vogel cried openly when she hugged several women goodbye near the gates. Other prisoners simply stood silent, too emotionally exhausted for tears anymore. James remained near the loading area helping direct civilians toward the trucks while cold morning wind moved through the compound. Then he saw Emma walking toward him carrying one small suitcase and wearing the same gray coat from the night they first met beside the fence. She stopped a few feet away. Neither spoke immediately. Around them, engines idled softly while guards called names through the damp morning air. Finally, Emma held out her hand. James took it carefully. Her fingers felt warmer now than they had during winter. Stronger too. "Thank you," she said quietly. James looked at her for several seconds before answering. "You do not have to thank me for treating you like a human being." Emma's eyes shimmered slightly at those words. Then someone called her name from the truck line. She released his hand slowly and stepped backward once before turning toward the gate. Halfway there, she stopped and looked back one final time. Rain clouds hung low above the camp fences while muddy water reflected the gray morning light beneath their feet. James lifted one hand slightly in farewell. Emma smiled then. Small, quiet, real. And a few moments later, she disappeared through the gates of Camp Eisenfeld, carrying her suitcase into a world neither of them fully recognized anymore. That evening, after the transport convoy vanished down the western road, James finally unfolded the paper she had given him. Inside, written carefully in blue ink, were only 2 sentences. You answered one whisper with humanity. I hope the world remembers how to do the same.